factory and social reform. So during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, I'm not going to lie to you, it was really, really difficult being a working class person because they were expected to work in the factories or down the mines. So factories employed people like, men, women and children, but mainly women and children because they were cheaper to employ. And there was lots of accidents in the factories, but nobody dared say anything because they would lose the home as well because the factory owner provided them with, a room to stay. Also, there was no guards on machines. It was very, very loud and noisy, and the conditions were brutal, really. And for the ones that worked down the mines, again, women and children were working down the mines as well as men. And some children as young as 4 were working in the mines and the factories. And actually in the factories, it was as young as 3. So some of the 4-year-olds were working as trappers in the coal mines. So they would sit there in the dark, then open the door for the coal to come out, then they shut it again, then open it again for the coal to come out. They were absolutely horrible, horrible conditions. So basically what happened is in terms of power to the people, they started to think, the working class, that these things weren't really good enough. But they needed some champions, if you like, to help them to try and get some sort of, social and factory reform. So one of these people was Lord Shaftesbury. He was a supporter of the 10-hour movement for the under-18s. He didn't think anyone under 18 should be working more than 10 hours a day. And obviously we would agree with that in terms of like work now. But in those days, they used to have to work 18, 19 hour days. He wanted them though to still have a job, so he couldn't make it so, they're going to have no work to do, because obviously the families would rely on them for some money. But he also looked at them getting a couple of hours of education a day, so to try and obviously, give them a way out of the poverty that they were living in. Now, something else that he was, very, very keen on as well was the Mines Act in 1842. And what he did there, after 28 children had been killed down at a mine in one incident, what he tried to do was to ensure that the mines, there was a certain age limit in terms of how old you had to be to work down there, only a certain number of hours a day and things, and also he wasn't really thinking that women should be working down there long term and things. So the Mines Act was important as well. So what he's doing is he's putting forward things that he's obviously unhappy with, and he wants to try and do something about them. And he relied heavily on factory inspectors and things to go into factories to see what was happening there. And what he wanted was for the reforms that he came up with to actually apply to all factories, not just one type of factory, but all factories. So Lord Shaftesbury was somebody who started to do things about factory reform. Now, social reformers, it comes under the same type of heading. In this time period, there was quite a few people who made some inroads into helping people in terms of social reform. So there was Robert Owen. So originally he'd had a mill in Manchester, and then he had one in New Lanark, which is Glasgow. And what he said was there should be 8 hours work, 8 hours recreation and 8 hours rest. So he thought the day should be divided into 3 parts, and this would be what should happen, because then people would be happy workers and they'd work more productively. Now, it was found that in his factories, people did just as much work in 8 hours as somewhere in other factories that were having to work for 18 hours a day. So this started to catch on, in some factories. People thought, this might be quite a good idea. And he was a really, really moral man, because he gave them decent places to live, and also he had built them like a social club and things like that. And if they swore, they had to pay a fine. So that money then went into trying to, help make the houses and stuff better. So it was really significant and important in terms of how he tried to deal with those types of things. He really tried as much as he could to try and help the normal everyday workers, and this is something he'll always be remembered for. And he also helped in terms of looking at, the Chartist movement. He was, like a supporter of those people. And in terms of it, he noticed that, it needed to have some people who were a little bit higher up like him to do something about it. Now, another social reformer was Edwin Chadwick. And he started to help reform the Poor Law, and it made a lot of people go into workhouses. Now, actually, a lot of people didn't like to go into workhouses, but at the time, it seemed like it was a decent thing to do, because at least it stopped these people being on the streets. So although that might have been a little bit unpopular, he was doing it for the best reasons. And another thing that he did is he noticed the link between dirty water and diseases like cholera. So in terms of that, he was thinking, right, people are getting, you know, diseases like cholera and typhoid and things like that, and all this is happening because of like the conditions that they're living in. So he made that link, which in the end is really helpful because it does help, obviously, you know, thousands of working class people. Now, there's two women that you need to know about in terms of social reform. Josephine Butler was one of these, and she was somebody who was really, really keen on getting the age of consent moved from 13 to 16 years old. Because in those days there was a lot of child prostitution because people were desperate for money. And it's awful to say this, but I'm going to have to say it. If you were someone who was like younger, in terms of being like, you know, a 10-year-old child prostitute, you were cheaper, okay, to sleep with. So the problem is there was a lot of child prostitutes about, and she just thought that was totally wrong. And she also was not happy with the fact that police could just stop women who were suspected prostitutes and examine them for, you know, sexually transmitted diseases. Because actually what she said was the problem for the women is that the men were the ones that were driving this prostitution, because they were the ones that might have had a sexually transmitted disease and then passed it on to the prostitute. And the problem was, because they were willing to pay for that, the women became obviously prostitutes because there was money to be made there. So she did a lot in terms of, you know, women and social reform there. So that law was then completely repealed because the police weren't allowed to just stop and, you know, examine them. Now, the other one that was on the back of the £5 note that I showed you is Elizabeth Fry. So Elizabeth Fry was a prison reformer. And what she was involved in doing is she wanted to make absolutely clear that these people, these poor people, should not just be being put in prisons. So what had happened was she went to Newgate Prison, which is in London, and she realised that there was full cells of women and children, so they were just sitting reading a story to the children and things. And she couldn't understand really like why they were there. And the reason why they were there was the simple fact that a lot of them were just poor, or that husbands might have got themselves in prison, so then they end up in there. So she looked into prison reform, and she had a school and a chapel built at Newgate Prison, and this was something that started to move things on because people started to pay more attention to what was happening in terms of prison reform. And these people we have a lot to thank for, because if it hadn't been them trying to be, you know, social reformers, things could have got even worse during the Industrial Revolution period.